our Linguistics Special Lecture Series, or LSLS, for the year 2026. I am Vinci Santiago of the UP Department of Linguistics, serving as the moderator for today. The LSLS features talks by invited experts on various topics under theoretical and applied linguistics and other related academic and social fields of inquiry. By the way, this event is also in anticipation of International Mother Language Day, which we celebrate every 21st of February. To my fellow faculty members and other faculty members of the university, to all the members of our audience, students, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. After the talk, we will have an open forum for your questions or comments on the lecture. We request that you keep your queries concise, to the point, and respectful. I am pleased to welcome today our speaker, Jillian Melchor. Jillian is currently a visiting research fellow, or VRF, at the UP Department of Linguistics, and a doctoral researcher under the research area on Ibero-Romance languages, Department of Languages, Faculty of Humanities, University of Helsinki. Here to talk about the sociolinguistics of CREOLE naming and the politics of language description through a case study of Chabacano here in the Philippines, let us welcome Jillian Melchor.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. Thank you to the Department of Linguistics for accommodating my lecture. I am very pleased to share with you the first article of my PhD. I will talk, if I have time, I will talk more broadly about my doctoral project later. But to take into account that this is the first article of a 4-article doctoral research project. And so this article has already been published. The title is "What do we talk about when we talk about Chabacano?" Is everyone familiar with Chabacano, I assume? Yes, you're all linguistics students. But here we will focus just on the phenomenon of naming languages. So even if the particular focus of today's presentation lecture is CREOLE languages, I think many of the issues that will be tackled in this presentation actually have important relevance to language description, language documentation, the naming of languages in general beyond the scope of CREOLE linguistics. So this article is part of a special issue published by the Journal of Pidgin and CREOLE Languages on naming issues. And as you can see, it focuses on CREOLE languages across the world. Does everybody know what the label CREOLE is? Can I get a raise of hands? If you're familiar? Yes? Okay, I see several hands. I can also delve deeper into that later, but more broadly, CREOLE language is a language that has emerged from strict contact between two typologically distinct languages. So, for example, in the Philippines, we have the term Chabacano is actually an umbrella term for distinct CREOLE varieties that emerged across the archipelago, as you can see in this very basic map here. And these CREOLE varieties under the umbrella term Chabacano emerged during the Spanish colonial period. So imagine, at the time, English hadn't instated itself as the global lingua franca. So in instances, in zones of extreme contact between Spanish or Spanish-speaking colonialists, traders, military officials, and local context, for example in Zamboanga, where different ethnolinguistic groups coexisted, people speaking Subanon, people speaking Cebuano, Hiligaynon. So imagine this context where there's no global lingua franca. How do people of different ethnolinguistic backgrounds communicate? So there is the need for communicate essentially produces a vehicular language by which these people speaking different languages with different grammars have to talk with each other. And this is basically the context of the emergence of the Creole varieties in the Philippines. But we are not going to delve deeply into how exactly these languages emerged, but it's very important to keep the colonial context in mind, because what we are going to talk about today is how naming practices, how linguistic scholarship actually have much more to do with complex historical and social practices than we would readily imagine. So what is Chabacano? I mentioned, it's the umbrella term for the Creole varieties. The major meaning most widely spoken varieties that exist in the Philippines are spoken in, the most widely spoken is in Zamboanga, with upwards 200,000, 300,000 speakers, and it's the most vital variety of Chabacano. And then there's Ternateño in the province of Cavite, which is not as endangered as Caviteña. So among the three major varieties, the ones spoken in Cavite, in Zamboanga, and Ternate, Caviteño or Cavite Chabacano is the most critically endangered. If you look at Ethnologue, which I'm sure you're familiar with, there are many ways in which the language name is listed. Sometimes it's listed with a V, sometimes it's listed with a B, sometimes it's listed along with a place name, Zamboanga, Cavite, Ternate. In Philippine bureaucracy, saying this is the Philippine Statistics Authority census from 2020, the same phenomenon occurs. So there are like various names by which this language, different language varieties are called. So you have Caviteño and then Caviteño Chabacano. What's the difference? We're not sure. What is happening here in the Philippine census is also often a conflation of ethnicity and language, which impedes scholars and students like us in language studies to have a very accurate number of how many speakers there are, what constitutes a speaker, how do we differentiate ethnicity from language, how is that reflected on the Philippine census. Those are issues that are actually important, but are not that are still sort of ongoing, not like decisively resolved. So basically, this is our case study for today, the term Chabacano. Why Chabacano? Well, this article problematizes the term as a label for the only Spanish lexified Creole in Asia. From a typological perspective, the Creole varieties in the Philippines are very unique because these are the only ones across Asia that are based on Spanish. So there are Portuguese-based, English-based Creoles in Asia, but the only Spanish-based ones are spoken in the Philippines. That's from just a global linguistic perspective. From the perspective of the Philippine social-linguistic context, it's very important because Chabacano often falls outside of, like dominant Austronesian typology. So how do we consider Chabacano? Is it an Austronesian language? Is it an Ibero-Romance language? This is a problem that occurs with many of the Creole varieties in the world precisely because Creole varieties are at this juncture, right? In the case of Chabacano, for example, I noticed through my social linguistic interviews in the past 5 months that it's as a Filipino who speaks Tagalog, who also speaks Spanish, it's very easy for me to follow Chabacano because the syntax is similar to the Philippine language syntax, but most of the lexicon vocabulary is Spanish. So in that regard, from a typological linguistic perspective, it's very complex, But also from a socio-political perspective, this is true not just for the Creole varieties of the Philippines, but basically for all of the languages of the Philippines, precisely because there are so many languages in our country, and that the issue of multilingualism is necessarily tied to issues of belonging, to political and cultural issues, etc. So from a more from a Creole linguistic perspective, why Chabacano? Also because why Chabacano and why look at Chabacano this way? Why focus on language names? It's because most of the scholarship produced about Creole languages in general, but specifically about the Philippine Chabacano Creoles, is structural of nature, is descriptive in nature. So the dominant mode of inquiry focuses on typological concerns. How is Zamboanga Chabacano related to Cavite Chabacano, and how is Cavite Chabacano related to Ternate Chabacano? Did these Creole varieties emerge independently from each other, or was there at some point a Proto-Chabacano? So this is the dominant mode of inquiring about Creole languages in the Philippines. So this study kind of extends descriptive scholarship to critical scholarship. And we do that by looking at the name Chabacano. Before going into where does the name Chabacano come from, does anybody in the audience know what the etymology of the term Chabacano? No? Okay, that's good, because then you will see why such an inquiry is relevant. But let's step outside of linguistics for a bit and look at how names are actually much more complex than they seem. Like, besides linguistics, there's like twin sisters such as anthropology and geography, where several instances of naming an object reveals how the very act of naming something can, by itself, be political, and if not intentionally, it may produce social consequences. For example, the name of our country, Philippines, right? The very name of the country, an independent post-colonial state, actually has colonial origins, and yet to propose a name now, an alternative name to the Philippines, can also have can also produce its own socio-political consequences. The same thing with current geopolitical issues, like our maritime dispute with China. How do we refer to our maritime territories? Generally, in this sense, naming by itself becomes a political act. It can be an act of resistance. Rather than calling it the South China Sea, those waters, the South China Sea, we can pivot towards our perspective and call it the West Philippine Sea, in order to assert our perspective, that we are naming, we are designating an object, if you will, through our own perspective, through our own agency. So this is kind of like the broad scholarship in which this study is situated. This is so this is just outside of linguistics. But of course, such issues are also very important in the field of language studies themselves. How are languages named? Who gets to name languages? So the practice of naming and documenting languages is actually intimately bound with issues of belonging, precisely because language has always been part and parcel of broader constructions of ethnicity, as I mentioned before. Often we conflate ethnicity with language, and this is why even naming a language may have and does have socio-political consequences. And there are unintended consequences of language naming when we think about who acquires the authority to name a language. We will go back to this later, but I will give you a more practical example of a case where language naming becomes contentious and where imposing a language name to a speech community can actually affect how the speakers themselves position themselves within the society, and it can actually affect the speakers' perceptions of their own identity. Are you familiar with the Sambali group of languages in the northern Philippines? Yes? Okay. Are you familiar with the variety called Ina Sambal? Yes? Are you familiar with the origin of the name Ina Sambal? Yes? Some say yes, others are probably unaware of where this comes from. So the first grammar of Philippine language, this was produced by a Spanish missionary. I'm sure you know that most of the earliest grammars about the Philippine languages actually were produced by Spanish missionaries, and this is why it's very important to incorporate critical theoretical perspectives in linguistics, because the field of linguistics itself has colonial origins. In the case of the Philippines, that's very true, because as I said, we trace the earliest language documentation to Spanish missionaries who were producing grammars, not just out of a purely scholarly interest, but also in the interest of converting the natives to Christianity. So there's this paper that says that actually traces the first Philippine grammar to the anonymous Acta de Lengua Zambala y Española, and this language could refer to one of the varieties of the Sambali group of languages in the northern Philippines. The first recorded enunciation, however, of the language name Tina Sambal appeared in the 1960s, towards the end of 1960s, beginning of 1970s, through a paper published by SIL, the Summer Institute of Linguistics. And since then, the term Tina Sambal, to distinguish this variety from other Sambalic languages, caught on. And it's appeared in contemporary scholarship, to the point that it's not just linguists referring to Tina Sambal as Tina Sambal, but also other scholars from anthropology. I think we also have an example from geography, but essentially the name caught on. Now, why is this contentious? Because apparently, the word Tina means bleached in one Sambalic language. Actually, I can read the example here to you. This is a contestation from the speech community. It's a blog from 2010s denouncing the name Tina Sambal as actually offensive, saying actually, can you read or is it too small? Okay, I can read. Tina Sambal, a correct term for our language or an ethnic slur? When and how did we get this term for our language? Just like our brave ancestors, we do not want to be called by another name. Sambal, that is who we are, not Tina, Tina Sambal, or Sambal Tina. You may call us Sambal Iba, Sambal Masinlo, Sambal Candelaria, or by the name of the place we live in, but not Tina. Because as I said, the term Tina itself has a derogatory connotation. It means bleached in a different variety of Sambal. And yet it's very, very difficult for a speaker in contemporary times to contend with a language name if that language name has been used and proliferated in scientific writing, because scientific writing, of course, has a wider reach than, say, a blog of a speaker. So actually names, and in this particular case, language names, may have unintended consequences. The linguist who called Tina Sambal might not have intended that, but this is the consequence that naming a language from an external perspective can have. So basically, this study uses Chabacano as a vehicle for interpreting language names as derivatives and producers of certain modalities of meaning making. So throughout this study, we are going to look at how Chabacano has been enunciated from the colonial period to the contemporary period to see in which context is the language name, does the language name Chabacano appear, what meanings do this language term evoke for its speakers, or for other Filipinos who do not speak Chabacano, for linguists, for Hispanists, Filipinos or foreign scholars who study Spanish, etc. So basically, the premise here is very simple, that by naming something, be it a place, be it an object, be it a language, you're essentially unintentionally creating a hierarchy, because by naming something, you also somewhat declare yourself as a producer of knowledge. And that essentially creates a hierarchy between yourself, the producer of knowledge, and the object of knowledge, this new knowledge that is being produced. Therefore we see naming as an epistemological practice. Who acquires the authority to name a language? So as I mentioned, in the colonial period, it was mostly European observers, travelers, explorers, colonial officials who essentially chartered the path for our historiography, for our own language documentation, for administration, governance, etc., by writing about the natives, by writing about what the natives spoke, how they spoke, etc. But of course, like we cannot just limit ourselves to the colonial period. The languages and their names kept on being used today. So in our current context, who has the authority to name a language or to repeat the name of a language, if any? So linguists, of course. But also the speakers themselves, and especially speakers who produce scholarship about their own language, also acquire the authority or the agency to name their language. So by subjecting language naming to critical inquiry, I ask several questions, which begins with, how did the name Chabacano even come into being or knowing? Is there a shared method of labeling among contemporary Hispanists? Here I focus on Hispanists, scholars who study the Spanish language, precisely because of the Creole nature in the colonial context of Chabacano emergence in the Philippines. They had a lot to say about Chabacano, or at least they are very active about it in scholarship, because there is an obvious link between the Spanish colonial context in the Philippines and the Chabacano varieties. How and in what context is the term Chabacano enunciated by members of the speech communities who author publications about their own mother tongue? So we can see basically the tension between etic perspectives, what people from outside the speech community say about Chabacano, how they use the name Chabacano, and also how the speakers themselves describe their own language, how they call their own language. And then us, of course. Are there any observable naming strategies among linguists who do descriptive work about Chabacano? How do I think this is basically the positionality of researchers, which is always going to be present when we are working with languages, because languages are spoken by people, and it's never straightforward, and it can get messy. So I think it's also important to take into account the perspectives of language scholars. How do they name Chabacano? How do they describe Chabacano, etc.? So therefore, we are looking at the diachronic and multisectoral corpus. So the corpus of text and do bear with me because this is very text heavy, this presentation. Because the study entailed laborious archival work. I remember looking at microfilms at the main library, the Filipiniana section of main library, looking at whether there are like hits, if I put Chabacano, and there are, that I would not have been privy to if I hadn't checked the microfilm section. So this particular study is based on a corpus of enunciations that, as I mentioned earlier, spans from the colonial period to the contemporary period. So we asked, and by multisectoral, I mean the tension between the etic and the emic perspective, so insider and outsider perspective. And then if you add to that the supposed neutral perspective of the contemporary linguist. So how did the name Chabacano come into being or knowing? Actually, Chabacano was not a language name originally. If you mention Chabacano in Latin America, Chabacano in Spain, they would likely think of something else rather than the language. Because originally, originally Chabacano was just an adjective to refer to something, a qualifier to refer to something executed in an unpolished manner without corresponding mastery, and therefore anything unworthy of praise or recognition is called that. So the language name, it actually comes from a very negative qualifier. And indeed, you can see the ways in which the Creole varieties of the Philippines were described, not even named, just described in colonial writing. So a German anthropologist called it Cordobinist Spanish, depraved Spanish. It has been called gibberish. It has been called unintelligible Spanish. It has been called Español de tienda, hawker Spanish. Or, as you can see, there are it recurs in language description. The image of a corrupt variety of Spanish always comes about in colonialist writing. Here are other examples where the Creole language is described in 19th century to early 20th century literature. So for example, Nieto Aguilar says the people of Zamboanga mix Moro Tagalog, Muslim Tagalog, that's how they called the language, the local language at the time, and Spanish, a language that all of them speak, albeit corruptly. Among the inhabitants of Zamboanga, a corrupt Spanish has established itself, consisting of Spanish and native words mixed up in various combinations by different individuals. Or sometimes you would have a direct hierarchical observation that Spanish has a more noble structure and a more pleasant flavor compared to lexicon, vocabulary derived from Filipino when describing the Creole varieties of the Philippines. So these are just language descriptions. Where does Chabacano come from then? How did it become a language name in the Philippine context? It's because whenever, in many instances in the historical archive, whenever a European observer would talk about the way that Zamboangueños speak, the way that Caviteños speak, the way that Ermiteños speak, they always add the qualifier Chabacano next to the language name Espanol. So these people would talk un Español Chabacano, basically a Spanish that is executed in an unpolished manner without corresponding mastery and therefore unworthy of praise or recognition. Now you might say, so this is kind of like the emergence of the language name Chabacano. Now you may say, okay, well that's sort of even expected, unsurprising in the colonial context, to the point that it wasn't just the way in which languages, the Creole languages were described. It was also assumed in a lot of historical writing that, well, the Caviteños, the Zamboangueños, the Ermiteños, they speak a deficient Spanish because they are cognitively deficient. So the language description in this case even extends into racialized discourse that is that kind of a racialized discourse that legitimizes colonial practices and that legitimizes the colonial project as a whole. But then you might say, okay, that's understandable in the colonial period because that was the hegemonic discourse at the time. How about now? How do we talk about Chabacano? And the conclusion that I draw from looking at this corpus of enunciations is that every time Chabacano is enunciated today, but in scholarly writing, is a reaction to that original meaning. So it's either by using Chabacano and by describing Chabacano, I duplicate this negative connotation that Chabacano is just simplified or corrupt Spanish, or a negotiation. Like, well, that may be the case, but it's part of our identity and we speak it and we're proud of what we speak. There are very few instances where the name Chabacano is outright rejected. So, as we see in the case of Tina Sambal, the language name Chabacano that was deposited in the archaeology of knowledge during the colonial period has stuck on, and it seems that there's very little alternative to the name despite its derogatory origin. What we can do is to look at instances where meaning is negotiated or maybe new meanings are produced. Let's first look at etic perspectives within the language ecology, where Filipinos in the immediate post-colonial period are the ones talking about Chabacano. This is from 1937, so that was already after Philippine independence from Spain, but still during the Philippine occupation of the United States. So Chabacano is that funny dialect, like a sort of Spanish gone wild. So here there is an Orientalist evocation of Chabacano as kind of the native version of Spanish, the uncivilized version of Spanish. Then there's also the idea that the Creole is an unintelligible speech variety. And these are Filipinos writing about Chabacano, not European observers during the colonial period. So one scholar writes, Chabacano, Spanish, like Caviteño, Zamboangueño, the commonplace thing there is to speak an English, which sometimes not even the English themselves understand. So this is a Filipino scholar talking about visiting the US and hearing how the African Americans talk English. So he draws a parallelism between that and how the Filipinos in Cavite, Zamboanga talk Chabacano. So they kind of speak an unintelligible Spanish. But I think what is even more alarming is that even as late as 2018, in a report by the Commission on Philippine Languages for the United Nations, Chabacano is defined as bastardized Spanish. Like, okay, bastardized is put in, entre comillas, sorry, I'm thinking of the Spanish term, within quotation marks. But still, this shows how racialized, derogatory language description from colonial period can carry to the contemporary, to present time, and even in institutionalized writing. So this is, so therefore, it's not at all surprising that some speakers themselves, and this doesn't necessarily appear in scholarly writing, but when in some of the social linguistic interviews that I've done, they would say like, Baroque Spanish is what they speak. Because these kinds of, like, as I said, language description, and in this case, language naming with a very clearly derogatory origin can be insidious to the point of affecting speaker perception. Let's look at contemporary Hispanists in the Philippines. So scholars who specialize in Hispanic studies and the Hispanic language and its connection to the Philippine culture. How do they talk about Chabacano? There's like a recurring idea of Chabacano being simple in nature. So it might not be as radical as a corrupt version of Spanish, but still there is an idea that it still positions Chabacano in a sort of inferior position to the colonial standard, which is Spanish, by saying, well, it's just simplified Spanish actually, or it's basically Spanish. Then there is an implicit depreciative value attached to the term Chabacanos. For example, in all of these, by the way, enunciations, all of these passages, I took from a scholarly magazine called Revista Filipina. Most of the contributions there are written in Spanish, so these are mostly translations. And as I said, they focus on the connection, the link between the heritage, if you will, the Hispanic heritage in the Philippines, or the link between Filipino culture and Spanish presence in the Philippines. And there is an implicit depreciative value attached to Chabacano. So for example, a scholar from writing in 2000 basically was lamenting about how Tagalog is being diluted by English, and this scholar uses the term Chabacanization, that there is a deliberate and widespread Chabacanization of the Filipino language. You clearly see there the social positioning in the hierarchy is still being maintained by scholars, and some of them Filipino scholars themselves. And also, again, the idea that the Creole is a substandard variety of the lexifier. So, for example, from 2009, a scholar says, well, Chabacano is not exactly prone to great praise because this watered-down Spanish, it only represents not even 1% of the total population of the archipelago. So, again, this is the duplication of the original colonialist statement that Chabacano is a corrupt version is still being produced in contemporary scholarship. To the point that scholars from the Chabacano-speaking communities sometimes reflect that or reiterate the statement. Like, for example, Zamboanga Chabacano speakers saying, well, Chabacano as a Vulgate is substandard Spanish, in the same way that Spanish, Portuguese, and French are substandard Latin. So there is kind of that hierarchizing discourse again. Or, for example, another Chabacano scholar remarking about how Chabacano, the Creole language, emerged. They said, well, the natives parroted the language and just disregarded the grammar and pronunciation altogether, which basically mimics what de Graaf, a known Creolist, calls as the degenerate offshoot view. This is a view that Creole languages, a very racialized view from colonial writing, that Creole languages were degenerate offshoots of colonial languages like Spanish, French, English, etc. But there are also, as I said, instances of negotiation where a new emancipatory meaning is evoked by the language named Chabacano. For example, this Chabacano speaker who writes in the same scholarly magazine as these scholars, who wrote very negatively about Chabacano, in the same scholarly magazine, a Chabacano speaker herself talked about Chabacano in a way that makes it at par, that kind of collapses that hierarchization, and it describes Chabacano as a language that is at par with the colonial standard, saying, I inevitably associate my language, Chabacano, with Castilian, since Chabacano is somewhat Spanish, or rather, it has a great deal of Spanish in it. You also see this not just in scholarly writing, but also in ordinances, in legislation. For example, in 2011, there was an ordinance in Zamboanga City declaring every June 23rd of each year as the Dia de Fundación de Chabacano. And it's basically a festival that is done in Zamboanga every year. It's very, very active, and there's a lot of funding from the local government for it, where the festival is entirely about Chabacano language. So they do Chabacano Film Fest, they do Chabacano song competitions, they do Chabacano Quiz Bee, or they even fund linguistic studies about Chabacano. And you really see how they construct the uniqueness of their Hispanic identity, the uniqueness of their identity, rather, in contrast with the other ethnolinguistic groups in the Philippines, on the basis of Chabacano, and on the basis of Chabacano being a product of Spanish colonialism. So this is what I mean by instance of negotiation. Yes, it came from Spain, but we are nonetheless proud of what makes our particular language, and by extension, ethnicity, ethnic identity, if you will, unique. In the same year, in Cavite City, an ordinance preserving, restoring, and promoting Chabacano in the city of Cavite was also issued. And here they also use the language name Chabacano as a semantic resource for their ethnic identity construction and why it's unique in the multilingual Philippine ecology. And then when we get to the contemporary linguists' perspectives, we see that in a lot of descriptive or typological or structural work, research work about Chabacano, the racialized discourses often recede into the background. So, well, okay, that's the context. It is common for Creole languages to receive derogatory names. This is an important point, actually, because most Creole languages in the world have names that have a derogatory origin. Chabacano is not unique in that sense. But as I said, like, these issues are often just mentioned in passing in empirically inclined work, and this is why I think that it's important for critical perspectives to be incorporated in linguistics, to not just to mention these often problematic phenomena in passing, but to actually delve into why such issues come about and how can we address them as scholars of languages. So another example of an adoption of etic pejorative terminology in a work from 2012. This is the work is from 2012. It's linguistic scholarship. Chabacano is referred to as a calo, el calo de la calle, meaning the calo spoken on the streets, or the calo of ermita. And if you know Spanish, the word calo in place of Creole, because the scholar, the linguist, could have just used el criollo de la calle, the Creole spoken on the streets, or el criollo de ermita, the Creole spoken in ermita. The scholar chose a term, calo, which in Spanish actually has, again, a negative connotation. Calo is, in the American context, is the Spanish spoken in the Mexican-American ghetto, or in the peninsular Spanish context, it's the language spoken by the Romani people, the Gypsies, who are also, who have also suffered a history of marginalization, social alienation, etc. So sometimes even linguists, maybe we might think that our scientific language, if you will, is neutral, but we might not be wary of the social baggage that the terms we use actually have. Well, instances of negotiation. Well, for example, there are many linguists who opt not to use Chabacano. I don't know whether that's because they know that Chabacano has a derogatory origin, so in place of that, they just use the umbrella term Philippine Creole Spanish. But again, you can say, well, that the focus there basically is the lexifier, so Spanish remains. So some people prefer, some linguists prefer to use Philippine Chabacano Creoles. So you pivot the term away from the lexifier, Spanish, and towards the Creole itself, Chabacano. And then some, instead of using Chabacano, they just use the place name. So instead of saying Zamboanga Chabacano, they just say Zamboangueño. Or instead of saying Cotabato Chabacano, they just say Cotabateño. But again, that can also be easily conflated with ethnicity. Are we talking about the language, or are we talking about the people who speak that language? So this study basically concludes, quite optimistically, that well, we can never, in this case, for example, we can never change the name. I don't think Chabacano anymore. Most of the people that I interviewed in Cavite, in Ternate, they use the name Chabacano. In Ternate, this is not in the slide, but this is actually important. In Ternate, they use Chabacano as synonymous with Platica de Baja, Platica or Platicada de Vara. Platica is talk or talk, like, and Bahra is the name of the place. So in place of Chabacano, then they say like, I speak the talk of Bahra, which is the language, the place. But they still use Chabacano too. So basically, how can linguists or scholars of language studies, specifically Creole languages, given this often pejorative origin of Creole language names, what can we do sort of to bridge this tension? Can we even do anything? Are we in a position to do anything? And as I mentioned before, I think that maybe we can begin by incorporating critical theoretical perspectives in order to go beyond descriptive knowledge, which is very, very important in terms of language documentation and language preservation. But also, maybe as an addition to that, we can also look into how, look into more or social political issues that often get overlooked or often recede into the background as we focus on empirically inclined scholarship. This is especially relevant, as I mentioned, in the field of Creole linguistics because of the social-political context of the emergence of Creole languages. Many Creole languages in the world came about emerged in slave plantations, in contexts of radical social hierarchy, and this is why increasingly there is an interest in approaching Creole linguistics from a decolonizing perspective. So yeah, basically what I propose is a sort of a case for humanistic linguistics, kind of to build an interdiscipline, a dialogue with critical theory, comparative literature, perspectives from post-colonial and decolonial thought in the study of Creole languages, but maybe even the study of languages as a whole, because as I mentioned before, linguistics does have a deep colonial origin, and the same as anthropology. And also, I think that we should also be wary as scholars who want to approach linguistics from a critical perspective. Maybe we should also be wary of not imposing top-down decolonization, which might mimic the very structures that we are trying to contend with, that we are trying to redress. For example, in a paper called Decolonizing Spanish, Ladino and Chabacano as Sites of Global Hispanophonia, the scholar, who is not a Chabacano speaker, a foreign scholar, basically writes, I have concluded that the genuinely decolonizing dynamic cannot accept any form of linguistic rehispanization or decreolization premised on the supposed unsuitability of the subalternized linguistic variety, even at the risk of language extinction. So basically, here, a critical scholar who advances the application of decolonizing methods in the study of languages somewhat still mimics the structure, as I said, like reproduces the sort of top-down imposition, in this case of a research ideology that might clash, might actually be might have tensions with speaker perspective themselves, because as we can see, what do we mean by a genuinely decolonizing dynamic? And if we mean a genuinely decolonizing dynamic to mean a total rejection of the Hispanic origin of the Creole varieties, as we can see in how the speakers themselves construct their identity, the very Hispanicity of their language is basically is a resource, is an important semantic resource, a source of pride for them. So I think that as scholars approaching languages from a critical perspective must also be critical of our own critical perspectives. It might be too meta, but the point here is I think that we really should seek how speakers themselves create knowledge about their languages, how speakers themselves view their languages, how speakers themselves view their identity in relation to their language, etc. So in conclusion, what is truly exceptional about the language named Chabacano is that its reclamation as a term by post-colonial Creole speakers does not stem from the rejection of their colonial past and all its attendant and therefore racialized discourses, but by the reframing of colonial intervention as the locus of their unique heritage. And you see this recurrently in Chabacano scholarship by Chabacano speakers themselves, and even in interviews. Because it is true that one very important limitation of the scope of this study is the perspectives of speakers who do not have the authority to publish. So this is something that I have been trying to redress through the sociolinguistic interviews, and it's something that I would also invite you students to look into if you ever get interested in the social politics of Creole naming in the Philippines, to look at naming practices outside of scholarship. Like look at how speakers themselves ask how the speakers themselves verbally talk about their own language in the day-to-day. So yeah, that's it. So as I mentioned, this study is part of a 4-article study that constitutes my research project. I don't know if I have time to go into this, but if you want to ask questions about the PhD later on, I'll be very happy to share it with you. And thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Jillian, for that talk. And it really, really shows us people in the academe that we unwittingly reproduce a lot of the colonial discourse that we say that we want to reject. And I think it's also very interesting especially for linguistics majors and practitioners of this discipline to see how this dynamic is reproduced for other languages. Coming to mind immediately, for example, are the so-called quote-unquote Negrito languages, how that label has been reproduced by the anthropological literature and the linguistic literature. So yes, those possible areas that we can apply these perspectives to, critical perspectives. So the floor is now open for questions or comments from members of the audience. We have 2 microphones on either side of the hall. Have quite a lot of time. Any questions or comments? Introduce mo muna yung sarili mo tapos si Ron tapos si Sasha.
Hello po. Good afternoon po. So my name is Ron and I'm a student at Cal. So I have 2 questions, although they are related. First, I've also seen like some debates on how Chabacano of today will be written. There's debates of like Hispanizing, preserving the Hispanized orthography and then indigenizing it. So can you give comments about that? Like based on your research, although I know it's not necessarily the topic for today. Another one, are there like other names for other Chabacano varieties besides their like toponyms like Pagkabateng or something?
So I'll answer the the second question first because it's easier. I have not encountered other language name to refer to Chabacano other than Platica de Bacra, the one that I mentioned before, which it comes from the place name. Or sometimes they also just call it Bacra. I don't have it with me, but there is like a textbook on Ternate Chabacano, and it's actually called Bacra, not Chabacano. So that's the only language name that I've encountered but it's still based on a toponym. I don't think I've found anything else in the literature or even talking with speakers that does not refer to the language that they speak as Chabacano or as a name related to a place. Yeah. But the first question is actually very pertinent. It's pertinent because I'll give you an example from the field work that I have conducted by myself and also with my supervisor, Eva Sipola, who will deliver the lecture tomorrow online. Saturday. Saturday online. I hope that you have time to watch her lecture. So the fieldwork that we conducted is specifically in Cavite City, where the language is critically endangered. The question of spelling is very relevant. Why so? Because the local NGO trying to preserve the critically endangered variety of Chabacano spoken in their area, one of their main goals is to because it has never been introduced, to introduce Chabacano in the basic education curriculum. But in order to do that, in order to establish a MOA with that ed, they must first have the blessing, if you will, of the Commission on Philippine Languages, KWF. And KWF requires standardized orthography prior to the inclusion of Chabacano, or any language for that matter, in the basic education curriculum. And one of the questions is, how do we spell Chabacano? Do we spell it following the Hispanic spelling? So do we adopt an etymological approach? Or do we adopt a phonemic approach and follow how it's spoken? So in that way, indigenize it, pattern it to how Tagalog is written on the basis of pronunciation. And we asked several speakers in Cavite City, what would you prefer? Like, first, are you in favor of standardizing orthography? Like, generally some people, they don't care. They're like, well, as long as I'm understood, I don't care. And they already write Chabacano because Cavite Chabacano, even if it's critically endangered, it has a lot of social media exposure. And people nowadays, they connect through Facebook, so they write Chabacano. Say, speakers who have relatives in the US, they write to each other in Chabacano on Messenger. And if I ask them, how do you write them? What spelling do you use? And it varies. And it varies based on also social demographic factors. So for example, highly educated speakers in Cavite City who know Spanish alongside Chabacano, they would prefer an etymological approach. Because again, they say that that's what renders the language unique. So why not reflect that in the spelling itself? Because that sort of, that harks back to the Hispanic origin of the language. So for example, trabajo would be spelled with a J instead of with an H. But then some speakers, for example, a deaf ed teacher who is a Chabacano speaker says like, well, maybe I prefer the indigenized spelling because that's easier for students to learn, for children especially. So I don't have an answer to your question. I can just, these are kind of like the tensions that you see within the community itself about what their preference is. Some would prefer a more pragmatic approach, as I said, especially teachers who say, baka nakakalito para sa mga bata pag biglang yung H naging J. Baka mas madali. Sinasabi nila na kung ang gusto nating mangyari, gusto sila agad, edi dapat doon tayo sa mas madali. But then, when you talk with other speakers, they might say, well, then, by doing so, we are diluting what makes our language distinct. But I guess, yeah, I think the important thing here is to talk with the speakers and see what their preferences are, and also to recognize that speakers don't have a kind of homogeneous agenda, or even about how to preserve the language, or even if the language needs to be preserved, how to go about it, etc. There will always be a plurality of voices within a specific speaker community. In the case of Zamboanga, they did adopt an etymological approach. There was a conference, if I'm not mistaken, sometime in 2010s, in that decade. There was a conference to establish a standardized Zamboanga Chabacano orthography. Because as I mentioned before, they have more resources, they have a wider speaker base. So that conference happened and they adopted an etymological approach. And like over 10 years later, that approach has also met criticism from scholars who looked at the Zamboanga Chabacano, who built a Zamboanga Chabacano corpus. That included, of course, a lot of writing from social media, and they see that, well, actually there are a lot of indigenized forms because again, we go back to demography, who writes and in what way do they write? So yeah, those are, I hope I answered your question.
Good afternoon po. I'm Simon from Linguistics. And your question ko po actually was about the spelling. So just to clarify, there are no clear or there are no significant linguistic differences between Chabacano and Chabacano. Chabacano with an E and
Even I have been inconsistent with that because the first study that I did about Chabacano was about Zamboanga Chabacano. And because they adopted an etymological approach, they opted for the V in that same conference. So they say, okay, to distinguish our variety of Chabacano, we're going to spell it with a V. In historical writing, it always appears with a B, precisely because it wasn't a language name, it was a qualifier. I wasn't in the Zamboanga conference. I don't know whether part of the decision to use the V instead of the B rests on, okay, this is a language name. It's not the qualifier that is the negative qualifier in colonial writing. But they did opt for the V. That's unique in Zamboanga. In Cavite and Internate, they would write it with the V.
And my second question po is, you mentioned that creoles emerge in slave plantations and context of radical political tension. I just want to ask, for the case of Chabacano, was Chabacano used as a language of resistance to Spanish colonization, or was it a vehicle for social activitization to fit in and to receive jobs, to achieve social mobility, etc., etc.?
That's a very interesting point. In the case of Zamboanga Chabacano in particular, it's the second one, it's the latter. So actually, if you read heritage publications about Zamboanga and by extension Zamboanga Chabacano, they talk about the privileged position of the Christianized Zamboangueños because they were working closely with the Spanish colonial authorities. So the Chabacano spoken in Zamboanga, which is the most widely spoken Chabacano and the most vibrant today, it is a result of the establishment of the military fort, the Fort del Pilar in Zamboanga. And as I mentioned before, it was already a multilingual locality. There were the Subanon, the Tausug, people who spoke Cebuano, etc. Because notice how if we go back to the map, like the creoles, creoles emerge in coastal areas because trade and military fortification is very important in the context of Creole emergence. In Zamboanga, it's the same thing, but it was the military fort. So what the Spanish authorities did in Zamboanga was to encourage hinimok nila yung mga nakatira. So they encouraged certain groups who already resided in the Zamboanga Peninsula to come and settle in the fort and to be converted to Christianity. And in turn, they will offer protection to these people against pirates, against Muslim raiders, because the Spanish needed a stronghold in the south because they knew that they could face resistance from Islamic groups. So they offered protection, and actually a lot of those early Christianized Zamboangueños joined the Spanish military ranks, and they were exempted from taxes. So they occupied a privileged position in the colonial hierarchy. So that when after the independence, these Christianized Zamboangueños became the elite of post-colonial Zamboanga City, and this explains why Zamboanga Chabacano is so vibrant. Is because most of the elites of Zamboanga today trace their ancestry to those like, let's say, original Christianized Zamboangueños. It's the opposite. In Cavite City, it's a bit more complex because Cavite City is also known for the Philippine independence against Spanish. Most of the heroes in our national historiography actually come from Cavite. And in that sense, the Chabacano spoken in Cavite doesn't carry kind of the same value of mestizaje, of miscegenation with Spanish as it does in Zamboanga. And that might also explain why Cavite Chabacano. Of course, that's not just a factor, there are several factors, but that could also be a factor why Cavite Chabacano is not as strong in Cavite because of the history of the province itself.
Any other comments or questions? Yes?
Hello, good afternoon po. I'm Rain from the Department of Linguistics rin po. So my question is, in the last presentation slide, it was mentioned that Chabacano speakers are claiming the language as a unique heritage rather than distancing themselves from its Spanish colonial roots. So I would just like to ask, how does this reclamation complicate or contribute to ongoing decolonization efforts within the academia?
That's a very important question. It's a question I don't have an answer to because it's actually kind of it's tension that I feel in my own research because I apply decolonial perspectives and yet I recognize that the speakers themselves they use in their identity construction they use this Hispanic connection as an important semiotic resource. I think what we could, I would not dare try to decolonize speaker insights because who am I? I would, if I would just probably apply decolonial perspectives in institutionalized settings such as scholarship itself. So as I mentioned in the field of Creole linguistics, if you look at the literature, there is still a debate these days. Actually, the biggest debate in Creole linguistics is: does Creole constitute a unique or exceptional typological category? Is there really such a thing as a Creole language that is typologically distinct from the rest of the world's languages? Because some Creolists would say that it's just a socio-political label, that Creole language is exceptional only because we can trace back the emergence, the circumstances of Creole genesis to colonial contact, and therefore it's not a typological but a socio-political label. So I guess as you mentioned, like, how does that contribute to applying decolonizing perspectives in the academe? I would say by recognizing that we cannot impose our own perceptions of what does it mean to decolonize to the speakers themselves, and maybe choose our battles. So, for example, if you're a scholar interested or a student interested in decolonizing perspectives and its application to the study of languages, then look at how linguists themselves might, as I said before, unwittingly reproduce colonial structures. Look at our own practices, not just by how we write and what we write about, but how we even conduct fieldwork. Are we extractive in the way that we conduct fieldwork? Do we just go to the field and just let's extract all the data and then publish to an audience that excludes the speakers themselves? Or do our projects have can it have any benefit to the speakers themselves, etc.? Yeah, I guess it's that. But it's an important question, I think, and it's one that I wouldn't dare answer because I'm also asking it still.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Okay, one more question. No? Audible? No?
Good afternoon po. I'm Emil and I'm from computer science, so I am very interested po, especially on the aspects where I see numbers and the demographics and such of the various varieties of Chabacano and such. So my question would be, if there were to be any quantity-based, like numerical-based study po, like say mathematical modeling po, to be done on documenting languages like Chabacano, what study po would you like to do, or how would you tell to that kind of studies po?
Thank you. I'm way out of my depth. I studied languages because maths didn't agree with me. but I think that is very important. Like if you're in computer science, especially. I don't know, like I'm just thinking of building a corpus building a corpus is very, very important, and it requires the skills that you have and people in your field have. For example, I know that there's a recent publication about the criticism to the etymological approach in Zamboanga Chabacano. If I'm not mistaken, that's written by a scholar from the sciences, because that scholar or similar scholars worked with computer scientists in order to build a corpus of Chabacano, especially of not so widely documented languages. I think that that kind of expertise would be very, very beneficial. But I think that's a cop-out answer. Maybe Martina has something more meaningful to share.
No. I just want to add, because we also want to be very careful with these emerging trends in technology, AI, and how it affects communities, especially indigenous communities, endangered language communities, because it can be exploited. So if we build this corpus without consent from the communities, it can be used against them. These communities are often the most vulnerable. They experience, you keep it from the government, the military, and we often hear them hesitating to share their knowledge, their language, because it can be used against them. So, mahabang discourse ito, it's sometimes tension between keeping yung collection, open access. So these are common practices in the field of language documentation, to keep the collection open access so that it can be used by multiple publics. But at the same time, yung safekeeping, how do people use our language collection? Again, this is an ongoing discourse na even linguists are disagreeing. Kaya let's try to listen to different perspectives about the use of the language.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you very much. And on that note, let's give a round of applause.